3, 2, 1. This week, we offer you episode 2 of our 3-part series with the Players Coalition. This is no laughing matter, y'all. We're looking at their work in addressing social injustice and racial inequality. We are honored this week to have with us former NFL great Doug Baldwin, who was a lights-out receiver for Seattle Seahawks. You Niners fan definitely know of him only too well and the pain he inflicted on our Niners over the past years. He joins us today to discuss his work with the Players Coalition, and we will be focusing on the 2 pillars within the Players Coalition that he is involved with, including the first, police and community relations, and the second, criminal justice reform. We are also privileged to have with us once again Dr. Chelsea Hayward from the Players Coalition leadership team. Thank you both so much for being with us tonight on Hidden Pearls podcast. So we're going to start with Dr. Chelsea Hayward. She was in our last episode and had an in-depth look at the Players Coalition, her work within the Players Coalition, their overall mission, and the 4 pillars that focus on their current work. We encourage you, if you haven't already, to go and listen to that episode so that you can really hear all the work that they are doing and how far their reach is. Dr. Hayward's work focuses on improving the effectiveness of athlete activism with an emphasis on systemic change, engaging athletes in action beyond awareness. Dr. Heyward is also a research associate for the Identity, Art, and Democracy Lab and a sport, culture, and power professor at Morehouse College. She also teaches sport and U.S. culture in the graduate program of sport management at California State University, Long Beach. Doug Ball.
And also a student of mindfulness, which we discovered in the last show. So, all right. Namaste.
Namaste. Doug Baldwin Jr. got his degree from Stanford. He is the president of Vault 89, philanthropic investor, and advisor to several organizations in the Seattle area, most notably the Invention Science Fund at the Intellectual Ventures. Doug was selected twice to the Pro Bowl and a Super Bowl champion, spent 8 years in the NFL where he studied leadership and team culture. He has been awarded the Martin Luther King Jr. Medal of Distinguished Service Award, and most importantly, Doug is a devoted father and husband. So welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. The mission of Hidden Pearls podcast is sharing the untold stories of the people and communities impacted by social and environmental injustice. And we definitely feel aligned with the work of the Players Coalition and both you, Doug and Chelsea. So thank you so much for being here.
Of course. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So Doug, I just got to ask, what's Vault 89? When you Google that, you know what comes up?
Yeah, it's a video game.
Yeah. There's kind of like these vaults and they're like supposed to be like underground or something, and
it's like apocalyptic zombie survivor.
Yeah. So I was like, hey, do you have your own vault, or like what is with that?
No, we don't have a website just yet. We don't, still underground. It's an investment firm.
Okay.
Yeah, we like to invest in independent entrepreneurs. So, people who don't typically get the normal education, go the educational route, don't typically have the traditional funding, but still have the passion and the drive to create their dreams. So we search out those people and invest in them.
Oh, that's really cool. So it's kind of getting out of the box a little bit and thinking about different ways to approach funding new people. So that's very cool. So maybe we'll come back to that a little bit. So great. Well, so as we said, so I've been a big fan of yours all the time, except for when you've been playing the Niners, because you've just sliced us and diced us a few times. So that's kind of painful, but you had a great career, amazing career, coming out of Stanford in 2011, playing for 8 seasons, and then retired in May of 2019, I believe, if I got all the data right. So I was just kind of looking at things for this, and I know there were some issues that year because the previous year you had a couple injuries here and there, and there were some things going on. Then I think Seattle with the contract and all that kind of stuff. And then you announced retirement. So one of the quotes I'd just like to read and just kind of chat a little bit about it. And it's not directly with Players Coalition, but I think it's such an important issue about kind of the transitions that NFL players face. And you just so aptly kind of approached it in that way. And then I also listened to the podcast you did, I think, with the Quarterback in Your Life guys. And you talked a lot about it in there too. So I really didn't want to just jump over it because I thought some of the things you had to say were super powerful and I think really helpful for really a lot of people in different life situations, but particularly if any of the players are listening. So here's the quote. This is right after your retirement. It was a process longer than just last year, Baldwin told ESPN.com. I think when you come into the NFL or any entertainment business as a young person, You have to be selfish. You have to be self-centered because it's all about self-preservation in that arena. I'm not saying this is the general population of athletes and entertainers, but I think a lot of us struggle with the concept of having a God complex, thinking that we're invincible and that we're immortal in some ways. And when you start to come to grips with the reality of being mortal and knowing that this is all going to come to an end at some point, you start to see the world differently. Perspectives change. I've been going through that process for a number of years. It actually started my second year in the NFL, understanding that eventually there's got to be a plan. It's more that for Baldwin, the challenge isn't about missing the sport that he played for most of his life. It isn't just about that. It's more that my identity has been wrapped up in football since I was 6 years old, he said. Navigating, not having the instant feedback and the false affirmation of what my value was in the world because I had caught touchdowns on some days. I'm navigating that as a human on a very human level. I want to read that sentence again. He said, navigating, not having that is not having the instant feedback and the false affirmation of what my value was in the world because I had caught touchdowns on some days. I'm navigating that as a human on a very human level. That process has been challenging, to say the least, but it's also been a rewarding one because it's allowed me to refocus my passions, but also to re-understand who I am in the greater scheme of things and how I fit into the world. So I know you, and you talked on the podcast that I listened to again, you talked a little bit about that. You talked a little bit about a period of what you felt like was diagnosed as would have been depression. And so there were some issues there. And the one thing that really stuck to me was you talked about finding yourself outside of the game, which I thought was a really powerful concept in that way. So that's a lot. So maybe just touch on this a little bit, of maybe about this invincibility and the God complex and some of this transition and kind of where are you now a couple years later into all this. So I appreciate you sharing all that.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you bringing up the topic because it's, obviously it's prevalent to me in my process after leaving the game. But to your point, I've heard a number of players talk about this transition as well. Some of my former teammates who are now leaving the game, experiencing this transition. For me, I've been playing football since I was 6 years old. So my entire identity, and, quite honestly, I've been really good at football since 6 years old. Right. So it's always been kind of like this thing in my life that's always brought me attention, always brought me affirmation, always brought me value of, my place in my community, my place in my social circles. And, when you get all that attention for so long and nothing else and you're always in that world, two things happen. Number one, you don't really work on the other parts of you, right? Like I wasn't a well-rounded human being when I left the game because I didn't work on those other aspects of my life. And then two, you kind of get this false sense of affirmation. You believe that you are more important than other people around you because you're getting this attention and this affirmation, this validation. So that God complex that I talked about, it really was just, you feel like you can do anything, right? Like, and when I say do anything, that it's separate from, feeling like you can accomplish whatever goals you set out to accomplish. It's really like you just feel like you're invincible, like nothing can harm you, nothing can touch you, and it's a very ego-driven mindset to be in. And, it causes a lot of problems, especially in relationships, right? Like a lot of my personal relationships, experienced this complex in a number of different ways. And so, really trying to take a step back through that process of retiring and realizing, like, number one, I'm not invincible, right? Just like every other human on the planet, Father Time catches up to you, right? And also, realizing that there's parts of me that, even though I very strongly believe to be true and to be right, may not necessarily be right. Like there's different perspectives out there. There's different ways of thinking, different ways to approach things. And I had to be open-minded to that. And I had to realize that just because it worked for me for, 30 something years doesn't necessarily mean that it works for everybody in the same way. And so really taking a step back from that was really difficult for me, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Well, and I guess, there's a couple of things I just want to one is I want to just hit the 2 points you made is one is that the game, when you're so pulled into it, because particularly the league, but I mean, playing at Stanford, any major D1 is going to be the same kind of thing. It's 24/7, for those years that you're there, and it's hard to have much else going on. And it's not about for most schools, it's not about personal development. And the league's not too worried about it either, because it's, 3 years and out for a lot of guys. And you came out as an undrafted free agent, I think, right? And so you made the team, and then not only made it, went on to Pro Bowls and all that kind of stuff, but the time commitment that players invest, about being great, studying and that. So in the podcast, you even talked about after the Super Bowl win against Denver, it was a bit unfulfilling. It was like, oh, this is all it is. And the very next day you went back and watched every single clip of that season to see where you were at and what you needed to work on, because you figured everybody else was taking a break. So that kind of time commitment and requirement, so it doesn't lead into kind of allowing an individual to really develop on some of these other levels. So, and then this false sense of self, that immortality kind of thing. So I guess, when we talk about it, we think about 4 different levels of transition. The one is entering, second is trying to stay past the 3 years. And then there's the mid-range where you kind of see the end, but you're in that, that period of your career. And then the one is like that transitioning out, and getting into that next stage. And so you really talk about all those kind of things. So well, let me ask a couple other things. Well, I rambled on there a little bit. I want to give Emma and George a chance, and or Dr. Heyward to jump in too. So if there's anything else you guys want to add on or comment on, please do. Everybody's good?
Well, in the transition of kind of like realizing where you were and processing and like starting to develop as a human, or develop in the areas that you felt like you hadn't so far, what were some practices? Because we're, like we said, very into mindfulness and meditation. Like, were there any mindfulness practices or like self-study practices that really helped you or grounded you or like opened your eyes?
Yeah, well, I don't have the education and the language to talk about it from a mindfulness perspective. I am aware of mindfulness, did go through some training while I was in the NFL, but really what it came down to was me being aware of how I was feeling, especially in specific moments, right? Just being aware of how I was responding, right? And for me, it was I didn't actually have that much of time to mourn my retirement. So I retired, and then 3 days later, my daughter was born. My first daughter was born. So as you can imagine, like, I'm coming from a world where I felt really strongly about having control over my environment and, how things played out. And then I have this new infant who, after I feed her, change her, love on her, she's still crying, and I have no control over anything. All right. So in those moments when my daughter was born and going through that process, it was like I really had to be aware of how I was feeling, right? How I was managing the emotions of feeling like I wasn't in control, right? And a lot of things that you would use in football, like anger and frustration, you would put your head down and you just go to work, and it was kind of easier to get those results back, right? But with a child, it wasn't. And so that was really difficult. It was really challenging. But I think probably the tool that helped me the most during that transition was just taking a minute to pause and being aware of how I was feeling, and then ask myself, why am I feeling that way? Right. So not really, and also being willing not to put myself in a place of guilt or shame because I was feeling those things, but just really giving myself grace to be a human while I was processing all those things. So yeah, I think that was probably the most important tool during that time, and still is.
Doug, you just perfectly described mindfulness.
Yeah, I was like,
if you don't have the words, dude, you just, I don't know where you got them, because you just did it. Because like,
you sound very educated.
Separating yourself out from the emotion, and then
paying attention to how I was feeling.
Right, and we talk all the time here about the Viktor Frankl quote about, our freedom lies within the pause between the stimulus and our response, and it's the power to choose our response, and that's what mindfulness is all about. And so you feel in the emotion, no guilt, you're just aware of it. You're like watching yourself on TV.
Yeah.
And whatever that is. And so I'm angry about this. Why am I angry? Debriefing it. And then choosing, how do I actually want to respond? Because I don't want to be angry with my infant daughter. And so you just perfectly described the whole process. So that's amazing.
The funny thing about that is I've had a lot of practice at it, right? Like that, what we do in football when we play a game and then we go back and watch film, right? That's the same thing. It's just, it has to happen in that moment, right? So I had, in order for me to really be patient with it, I had to trick myself, right? Like, okay, I'm just watching film, right? Going back to watching film of myself interacting with my daughter or my wife or with my friends, playing it back and saying, okay, I could have done this better. Or maybe I could have put my left foot here instead of here, right? So all of those things that I had used in football to get better, I was trying to use those same tools to be a better, well-rounded human being afterwards.
Right. Yeah, that's terrific. So, well, kudos to you for learning it on the fly like that and not calling it mindfulness. So maybe you'll help teach us. We'll do a class on it. You can help teach it.
I'm not that far along. I appreciate the vote of confidence, but I'm definitely not that far along.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to the voting thing because I heard too about you potentially running for office. So we'll have to come back to that issue as well.
Who told you that? No.
You guys talked about it on that podcast, right? Remember?
Yeah, and I told them no, it's no chance.
I know, but it's 2 years later. I thought maybe. So, okay, well, let's move on. We'll keep going. So, and Dr. Hayward, we're not jump in anytime, okay? So I'm not trying to okay. So we got through that, and then so our podcast specifically, we like to talk. So during the season, we talk with charities. That's what we do. So we have a player from the team we're playing, and then we speak with a charity from either the Bay Area if we're at home, or from some the area in which we're playing. So New York, we picked a charity out there, and we talk to their staff. And the idea is to share the stories of the people and communities impacted by social and environmental injustice, so that we're trying to lift up some of the charities doing the work out in the field. And so one of the things that we're really curious about is, kind of what motivates people and what their bigger why is. And so I just want to read this quote because this was also in the article that I quoted from. And then just maybe you could share with us a little bit about that. You seem like a very kind of intentional person as you're thinking about things. So this is also related right after your retirement. So Baldwin spoke to us while standing on a patch of grass near an elementary school in Renton, Washington, where he's working with local officials to build a $15 million community health center for underserved youth. Baldwin said the hope is to break ground in February now that $10.5 million has been raised, which includes $1 million of his own money and a $70,000 donation from the Seahawk. The proposed site is a short drive from the team's headquarters. So you're definitely ingrained in there. So I'd love to hear an update on that project. And then just if you could share with us a little bit about your why. So with the Martin Luther King commendation and that, I know you've been working in the field and out there giving back to people for a very long time. So maybe you share with our folks a little bit about what is your why do you do all that, and give us an update on the youth center.
Yeah, so I think when this article was written, this was pre-COVID. And so when COVID hit, obviously that threw a wrench in everything, right? All municipalities, I've been working really closely with the city of Renton. So all municipalities got hit. And so we're up to, it's obviously $15 million, but we're up to 14 million now. But we haven't broken ground yet just because, just the way things happened, right? We're hoping that we'll be able to break ground this summer. So we have 14 million. We have the permits, we're shovel ready. It's just the cost of lumber. We're waiting for that to come down a little bit more, right? As we all know. Yeah. So we're moving forward with that. And I guess I'll speak to that specific project, the why behind that specific project, and then that why will speak just, the why in totality. But, I grew up in the back end of the Salvation Army in Pensacola, Florida. And it wasn't a $15 million facility. It wasn't a beautiful facility. It was, it was the rundown back part of the Salvation Army. We had a basketball court. We had a couple classrooms. We had a lobby. And that was about it. And then outside, we had a couple of football fields, right? That was where I spent the bulk of my time as a child. And, I didn't realize it at the time, but that environment had such a major impact on me as a child. And then obviously, as I grew up, who I became as a young man, as a young adult. And so now looking back on it, and at the time when we were starting to build this, I look back on that time and realizing that facility had a profound impact on my life, right? I could have gone down a number of different paths. But quite frankly, and quite honestly, like that facility kept me sane, kept me healthy, in a lot of ways. And it wasn't just because it wasn't this beautiful facility. It was just the people who made that place a second home, right? It was really safe for us as kids just to come there and be kids, right? Like to genuinely just be kids. I played sports there. I got my tutors there. I'm in contact with my mentors from there. So that place just had a profound impact on me. And so, when I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, all athletes, they have a foundation or they do some type of community work, right? And I wanted to do the same thing. I wanted to follow in those footsteps. And so I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And it felt like a community center was the perfect fit for me, right? It was something that was near and dear to my heart, something I had a direct connection to, something that I could visualize, and I thought that we could build. And so I worked together with a community health organization called Health Point, the city of Renton, the state, the county, a number of big players in the area just came together to make this work. And so, it's been a several years in the process, but we're very close to it. And the why, essentially what I truly believe is that all humans are the same in the aspect that all of us want to be seen and loved and respected for who we are. There's a core value at the end of the day. Like, I just think people just want to be loved, right? Like, Chelsea and I were actually talking about this the other day. Just, how many problems in our society can be solved just by people really feeling loved, really being seen, flaws and all, and still being loved and respected and forgiven for when they make mistakes. Like, what is the impact of that long lasting? And I experienced that at the back of the Salvation Army, right? I was a kid. I made several mistakes as a young kid, but they still accepted me. They still loved me. They still forgave me. And I know that had an impact on me as a child. And I know, obviously I'm speaking to it this present time as an adult. And so the why behind all of the stuff that I do in the community is really trying to have an opportunity for people to be seen, and it doesn't have to be some grand project or event. It's really, and I know it sounds cliche, but it's like one person at a time. If I can get into a room with one person and have a conversation with that one person, look them in the eye, actually hear their story, read their body language and their mannerisms and feel their emotions, and then respond in a very empathetic way. Like, you break down all the barriers, all the walls, and you're able to have a real genuine relationship with somebody. I know we're going to get into it later, but as it applies to social activism and social change, like, I truly believe that's the only way we're going to get closer together as a society. The only problem with that is that it takes a lot of time, right? It's just labor intensive in that way. Yeah, it's building a relationship, and building relationships take time. So the why behind that is really just, I know the impact for me when I was truly seen and loved and accepted for who I was. And so I just want to return that feeling and emotion to the people that I engage with.
So love others as you have been loved.
Treat others how you want to be treated.
Yeah.
Amen.
That's beautiful, Doug. Thank you. That's really
I would
cool.
still like to have you do a course with us, because you could just say that. I'll just cut up the podcast and put that in.
That's a podcast by itself.
But I can't affirm that enough, right? I mean, because it's really the personal touch that changes people, that opens their minds, that creates empathy, some kind of connection, and then we can get kind of past the way in which we isolate ourselves on issues or positions and that kind of stuff. And so we start to understand, because I think you're right. Like, the idea about just being loved, unconditionally loved, not that we're not held accountable, and having those connections with people. And I think, that at the end of the day, we want to go home and protect our family and take care of our family. And we want to love them, and we want them to be loved by others. So
I want to bring up the first episode of our off season, we had Dr. Jen Welters on. And one of her quotes from her book is, empathy is a leadership skill. And it's something that's kind of been like ringing true for all of us, or the rest of the season, but just like, you can't lead somebody to change, or you can't actually make a change or like be the change that you want to see, unless you can have that empathetic connection with people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I take it a step further, and I would just say, it's a part of a relationship, right? Like, I look at my daughters, and, in order for me to be the best father that I can be to them, I have to be empathetic. I have to actually be patient with them, understand, even when they get frustrated, they're little children. When they get frustrated about something, even though sometimes I'm not always good about this, but trying to take the time to be empathetic about why they're getting frustrated, right? And speak to them at their level, so that they feel seen and recognized for their emotion, right? And not feel invalidated for that emotion. And I think it's so powerful. Like, when you want a healthy relationship, whether it's with your children or with your friend or with your significant other, that empathy, I can't stress that enough. And yeah, I definitely believe it's a leadership quality. I've seen it, and George, you can speak to this too. Like, when you have leaders on a football team that create and cultivate a championship caliber culture, those leaders have empathy. They worry and are concerned about the other players as individuals on the team. And that it's such a powerful trait. It's such a powerful thing.
And it's also, empathetic leadership is a study. And so to that quote earlier, it's true. And one of the professors that I work with at Morehouse, Dr. Kristen Moody, teaches an empathetic leadership class. And one of the things that she's always trying to differentiate between is empathy and sympathy. And so empathy is when you can meet someone where they're at and care with them. But sympathy is when you're using your power over someone to care for them versus caring with them. And so to that point around leadership and teamwork, empathy is a really important cornerstone. And then getting into some of this work, it also becomes integral to supporting the communities from an eye-level perspective versus looking down at someone.
Yeah,
it does. It shifts the nature of the dialogue, in that way. So it's a really different thing instead of a kind of a top-down. It's like you're inviting everybody to the table, or at least those 2 or 3 people, and then having a kind of a conversation built on mutuality and shared power and shared inclusion and all those kind of things. So, well, before we jump into the next thing, we're going into the Players Coalition. I guess I just wanted to touch too on, you talked about the sense about identifying your emotions, and doing that even with your daughters. And I just think it's so true that, particularly as men, and I don't know the women's world as well, but, we're trained a lot not to deal with emotions. So like you said, in football, we may get angry and are frustrated, but we're not supposed to talk about it or share it. And we're supposed to just deal with it mostly through, physical action of some kind. Like I grew up on John Wayne, right? If you get mad, you walk in the thing and you punch somebody in the face. And then you do whatever you do. I mean, it was like you never talked about anything and you never asked for help. And it was this whole solitude, warrior out there doing all that stuff. But in truth, the emotion is the doorway to knowing the self, like that exercises that you were talking about. And it's also the doorway to really solid relationships, but it's something that people are really scared about. So just, again, affirmation on that, because that's an amazing skill and trait, and it's something to work at. And if you're empathetic about it, then it opens it up and makes it a little bit easier to start working into those gateways. So, okay, so George, why don't you read this on the Players Coalition stuff? Introduce us that way. So anyway, just super grateful, Doug. Thank you. That was really powerful, and appreciate you sharing those with us. So let's jump into the Players Coalition, and we'll keep working on that. And Dr. Hayward, you can keep giving us leadership quotes. I love that. That's great. We want to talk all about leadership because we think that's super important, particularly in the context of systemic change, because it's going to take a lot of folks working on that. So thank you.
All right, so the Players Coalition, we exist to end social injustices and racial inequality so future generations have the opportunity to thrive without barriers. And their mission is to achieve social and racial equality using Players Coalition influence and support to impact systemic social and civic change in the areas of the 4 pillars, 1 being policing community relations, 2, criminal justice reform, 3, education, and 4, economic advancement in low-income communities.
All right. So this week we're talking about criminal justice reform and policing and community. And so let's see. And then, so Dr. Hayward, I don't know, I was going to look at the guiding objectives first on each pillar. Does that sound okay? Place to start with you guys? And then we can just kind of unpack those things. And so for folks who haven't done it, I'd encourage you to get to the website for the Players Coalition. They've got a really nice setup, and the pillars are all explained. They have kind of these categories. So guiding objectives, areas of focus, top line stats, and then Player Coalition wins, which is where they've advocated for some kind of level, usually some kind of legislation at the state or federal level, which has made some kind of change. So encourage you to look at it. So let's take a look at policing and community. So the guiding objectives, and I'll just read these and you guys can jump in and explain a little bit more depth on any of this stuff. Okay. Oh, Emma, you look like you were microphoning me. Okay. All right. 1, end racial disparity and criminalization of poverty in policing and criminal justice. Dr. Hayward, you better explain that to us.
So really, we've seen in the last year in the heightened level of attention that issues related to policing have gotten, that there's a big racial disparity between who's getting prosecuted, who's getting arrested for these issues, who's getting violently arrested for these issues, and what that relationship between the police and the community has been like. And it's trickled down into that second guiding objective related to trust, because if the police and the community can't trust each other, then there's instantly this friction. I'm sure you guys have heard about how Black people feel when there's a police officer behind them. You feel that tension immediately, and that's because there's a lack of trust. I don't feel safe with being in this situation. So then just taking away your thunder there on that third objective around data-driven methods, recognizing that without that information, it becomes sort of a he said, she said, or they said type of situation, pitting the community and the police against each other, when really these issues aren't always as black and white as they appear to be.
Okay. And so and the third one is supporting data-driven methods for police accountability. So that, I think, would be, who's the law enforcement person, who's in the car, that kind of issues, and then looking at how the stop happened, what was the basis for the stop, and really keeping track of the data that related to all that, and what were some of the outcomes, and making sure that everybody, no matter who you are driving that vehicle, gets treated fairly and safely in all aspects.
Yeah, and in addition to if something goes wrong, holding that person accountable for what happened.
Right.
That's when we get into some of the qualified immunity stuff, it's one of the only professions in the world where you're essentially not civically liable for what happened. So if you are a football player and you hurt another football player, it's a sort of similar situation where they technically can't come in and sue you in civil court. But in other professions like doctor, dentist, these professions where people are meant to care for the safety of another individual, there is that standard, and that's not being seen unilaterally across policing, which is where that accountability comes in, because less than 1% of the time are police convicted for usually black deaths, but recognizing that there's a disparity between potentially an intentionality and even if it were an accident, giving some sort of recourse to the families that lost someone that maybe that was their primary breadwinner and now they don't have the opportunity to get their life back the way that it was.
Right. Well, let's just keep working down this one then, because we kind of already got into, because you talked about qualified immunity. So areas of focus around the guiding objectives, policing in schools, and there's a whole bunch of stuff on that. And I'll just read these and then you can kind of take it where you want to go. And there's some stats in there. The second was police transparency and accountability, which you kind of talked about, and then police misconduct, kind of reviewing that and how to hold them accountable for those things. And I'll just do some stats on it, and then you could talk a little bit more about qualified immunity if you want. Maybe we should explain that for folks. They might be a little confused on that. So some of the stats. In 2019, almost 1,100 people were killed by police. In 2020, there were over 1,100 people, which averaged 3 per day. And in 2020, there were only 18 days where there was not a death at the hands of law enforcement in the United States. And 50% of the people who died in 2020 were people of color. So those are some stats for that. 3 times more likely to be killed if you are black, and 1.7 million students attend school with a police officer but no school counselor. So those are kind of there. I'll just toss those up, and you guys can run with those a little bit on areas that you think are real important to follow up on, please.
Yeah, I think I want to actually reaffirm what Doug was saying earlier, and it was important to give that space because it almost mirrored what is going on with these systems. So when you were reading a quote about him talking about false affirmations of what his value was in the world, these negative interactions reiterate that. And so he spoke about believing that you're less important or believing that you're more important than other people around you. But I think the reverse is true as policing and criminal justice has evolved today, in which citizens primarily of color believe that they are less important than those surrounding them. And so it's a whole interesting dichotomy because it's the same population, usually people of color, elite athletes, and some of the people involved in these policing situations. But it's important then going back to the work to recognize that policing is a really hard job. My cousin is a chief of police out here, and I understand the day-to-day things that police go through. And so understanding that we're asking them to do things that aren't necessarily within their scope of work. And so all of that to say, going back to the areas of focus with policing in schools, transparency, accountability, and police misconduct, if we were able to shift some of that to what made hone in their scope a little bit to make the job more digestible, I think that would be the direction that would be safest and most appropriate for where we're at today. And I know Doug has a ton of background here too, so I want to give him space to share.
Yeah, I'll touch on the last point with the 1.7 million students have an officer in their school but no school counselor. You know, you're going to hear me say this a number of times, and I hate to sound like a broken record, but it comes back to empathy again, right? Give you more context. My father was a police officer for 35 years in Pensacola, Florida. And so, I'm coming at this from a perspective of I had a father who, when he left the house at night, because he worked at night mostly, I was worried about him coming back home. I didn't know if I was going to wake up and my father was still going to be alive sometimes. Right. So I had that perspective, but also had the perspective of that when I was driving down the street and there was a cop behind me, I got really nervous. Even if I was not doing anything wrong, it just, there's this feeling that comes about when you're a Black person in America and the cops behind you, quite frankly. And then you have 1.7 million students who have an officer in their school, but no counselor, right? So, and I'm not saying that having an officer in the school is a bad thing. I think if you spoke to a number of people, you'd have answers on the full spectrum, right? Like when we were kind of in the depth of this work at the beginning of our, starting this, I had a number of conversations with people in the community, and, some people said they didn't want officers in the schools. Some people said they did. My first interaction with an officer that wasn't my father in school was a DARE officer, right? He was a really good guy, and like made me feel confident about approaching a police officer if I needed something, right? But I know some students don't have that. That's not the case. That's not their interaction. And so, when you have students who have an officer but no counselor, to me, it's just a lack of empathy, right? It's a lack of understanding. When you have students who have gone through the trauma, who have seen the trauma, right, and now are afraid to go and interact with these police officers, you need another apparatus to help them get through that, and sometimes it's not the parents, because sometimes the parents have those same emotions and those same feelings. And so there's a lot that can be done there. And to the overarching theme of this conversation, it's going to take empathetic leadership to get us there. And progress is slow. So I know it's going to take a lot of time. But at the same time, I think that's the direction that we have to go in. And as a Players Coalition, not only are we doing it on the ground level with initiatives and, legislation, but we're also making sure that we're educating ourselves and those around us so that we can facilitate that leadership to be in place to help effectuate that change.
All right. Well, thank you. Okay. I don't want to cut any. Dr. Chelsea, you want to talk a little bit about qualified immunity then? Because we're kind of on this track, and then we could kind of work that, and then we'll jump over to some of the criminal justice reforms, which is a little bit connected.
Yeah. So qualified immunity is essentially a court-established doctrine that protects officers from civic suits. So they can be tried for the case from a federal level, but if the individuals involved in the case wanted to sue that officer personally, they didn't have the jurisdiction to do so. And so the reason why this is important is because understanding that most of the times they aren't going to be found guilty, there's no, again, recourse for that family should the incident have been even perceived as unjust. And so an example there is that we use a lot is that if there's, for whatever reason, if an officer's aiming their weapon at a dog and then a kid startles them and they accidentally shoot the child and the child dies, there's nothing the family can do to get justice for that child. That's just where we're at. And so that's important because for it to overstep qualified immunity and for them to get out of that doctrine, they'd have to prove an identical precedent. So they'd have to prove or find a case where that officer specifically had aimed their gun at a dog and shot a child and it was intentional. And just the chances of that happening are so rare that it doesn't really happen. And so understanding that level of protection, again, in professions where these officers or these individuals are supposed to be looking out for the safety of individuals and are instead inflicting harm, becomes a space where, back to empathetic leadership, we want to empathize more with the community who are taking the brunt of these incidences.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so it's, and we don't want to get too legal with it, but I mean, there's a standard of negligence, there's standard of recklessness. So there's a variety of standards in the civil suits that could apply to some of these things, but basically in the qualified immunity arena, unless it's a violation typically of a protected constitutional right, so you could win a civil rights claim to some extent, it's super difficult, just like you said, under those terms. And these are kind of state by state sometimes, and so they're very unique in that way, but they do protect folks from what seems like very egregious behaviors at times, and leaves, like you said, families just hanging out there with nothing.
And egregious or not, anything's on the scale from theft to murder, or even just officers protecting other officers from having their rights revoked or having their day in court. All of this system that's working against the community versus a profession that was meant to protect and serve. The idea is to level that playing field.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about what the Polaris Coalition is doing to do that.
So we've been doing a lot over the past year, but essentially trying to get this implemented at a federal level. Obviously, that takes time and is slow, as Doug had mentioned earlier. Anything at the federal level takes a ton more time than it does at state and local, which is why our work focuses there. But then now finding the doctrines, which there's a lot more now on the table, or at least up for consideration based off of what had happened last year with the George Floyd murder. But going state to state and finding ways in which we can support that doctrine. So there's a ton of different opportunities. Ben & Jerry's Ice Cream has been one of our pillar partners in ending qualified immunity. And the work that they've been doing there is essentially doing the same thing, but at a larger scale. So beyond just athletes, any influencers, any entertainers, any people in positions of power, getting them to come and advocate for these bills so that while the federal thing takes time, we're able to implement these locally and get laws changed at the state level.
Okay. All right. Let's see. I guess we could wrap this up. You've got some issues down here about 5 ways we can end police abuse of people of color. So I'll just do the first one. Adopt immediate interventions of non-lethal and more socially focused. So I think that kind of ties back to what you were talking about. We're asking law enforcement to do a lot of different things that are really difficult and require typically a lot of different kind of trainings in that. So in that context of having empathy with that, maybe the creating different opportunities for interventions in some of those situations that would not be lethal and would be more social. So kind of taking that maybe off law enforcement and or expanding that role a little bit in different ways. So you want to say more on that one, or is that okay?
Yeah, that works in practically. And the most recognized example is ending chokeholds. There shouldn't be a situation where someone else can put that sort of power over someone to take their life.
Right. Which is, that has been a bit of a movement through this whole piece. So we are seeing some more of those efforts. Okay, number 2 is reduce what law enforcement is allowed to do and when they're allowed to do it. So putting some restrictions on those kind of things. So maybe not pulling a gun on a traffic charge if somebody does leave because you got their license plate and we can find them later maybe. So some things like that. You want to give any other examples or talk about that one?
Yeah, just redirecting those resources. And so rather than if there's a mental health disturbance at a home, rather than calling an officer, calling a mental health professional who's been trained to deal with those situations, both either at the home level, at school, wherever that exists, making sure that the right people are in position to de-escalate.
Yeah. And Doug, I think in the other podcast, The Quarterback in Your Life, you talked about you worked on a law in Washington that I thought expanded some of the training that law enforcement was going through, or at least you were working on that. Do I have that right? And some of it had to do with kind of counseling and some mental health pieces.
Yeah, so Initiative 940 was actually passed into law last year, or 2019. And yeah, it was, going all the way back, there was a clause in our in our statute that basically said in order to bring charges on a police officer, you had to prove malice, which is premeditated murder, essentially, right? You can't prove that, right? Because officers wake up and they put a gun on their hip, right? So you can't prove premeditated murder in that way. And so being able to, and we were, I think, one of the only, I can't remember how many states, but we were one of the only states left in the country that had that clause in our statute. And so we're kind of just updating the statute to come, bring to the 21st century and really have that underlying element of accountability for law enforcement. Now, I think at the beginning, the conversation was they felt like this was going to make officers' lives less safe. But what we found is that it has obviously decreased the amount of interactions with law enforcement in that way and, increased the opportunity for officers who fail to uphold those standards to be held accountable. And so that was a big win for us in the state of Washington. And I think, as a model for the rest of the country, I think it's going to be good for us moving forward.
Okay. Let's see. One of the other ones, increase accountability and consequences. I know we've kind of touched on that. Anything else you want to add on that one?
I think an example there is something that we had worked on. I think I mentioned it last week, but we had worked on with Malcolm Jenkins and Natasha Cloud from the WNBA, where they helped to establish a civilian oversight board. They helped to push forward the legislation that established that board in Philadelphia. And so getting situations set like that in other cities would be really important, because then there breeds that accountability, which if there's accountability and more importantly, communication, you can then build back up that trust between the community and police.
Okay. Elect officials who believe in prosecutorial accountability. So we probably have to explain that just a little bit. So prosecutorial are either county attorneys or district attorneys, depending on the language from that. They are the chief law enforcement individual. Typically, they're structured by counties. There'll be one for cities, and then there's actually one for each state. And so those are the folks within that jurisdiction that are responsible for making charging decisions and going forward with trials and or convictions. So when we talk about prosecutorial accountability in that context, what is the Players Coalition thinking about?
So that example takes us back to Philly also, but there's a district attorney there named Larry Krasner, who's a very progressive district attorney. And we've seen over the last several years, a lot of these more progressive DAs pop up and win their elections. And so what happened most recently with him, actually a couple of weeks ago, was that he was reelected. And so it's starting to prove that not only can these individuals get elected, they can stay elected. And so they can continue pushing for the reforms that begin to shrink the gap between what's happening to the community and what's happening for or in benefit of some of the people in positions of power. And so having elected officials, meaning people who are also in positions of power, being able to hold other people in positions of power accountable becomes important when you look at that systemic change piece again, because we can speak up all we want, but if there isn't anyone speaking across, then we lose that pivot point for change.
Yeah, which somebody else. But anyway, just which takes us kind of in this next one, because the historical language about this was being tough on crime, and nobody wanted to be progressive in that context, because then you weren't tough on crime, and then you wouldn't get elected again. But it takes us to this next one about, well, if we're having that conversation about public safety and what's good for the community, let's talk about the impact of mass incarceration and the police brutality that we've seen, or these misconduct on the community and people of color. So that's kind of all part of that conversation, which now, with some accountability and kind of progressive thoughts on it, people are getting reelected, and so maybe more people will find the courage to have that same kind of voice to bring these things to more jurisdictions.
Right, and to trend some of these issues back towards a positive direction. And so if you guys haven't seen the 13th, the documentary by Ava DuVernay, that's one that tells the story just so incredibly, but recognizing that 500% increase in incarcerated individuals over the last 40 years, I believe, which we had worked on a campaign a couple years ago that also identified that 1 in 50 kids in the United States has a parent in prison. And so when you think about then trauma that Doug was speaking to earlier and what impact that has on their adolescence and then growing into a functioning adult, where you've had a key pillar of your home taken away, or you've seen things that maybe you shouldn't have seen, so on and so forth, that becomes an issue. And then recognizing that people of color make up 37% of the United States, but 67% of our prison population, all of these skew towards there being systematic discrepancies within our mass incarceration system.
Okay, which takes us right into criminal justice reform, which would be great. But Doug, Dr. Heyward and I have just been chatting here for a while, so my apologies. So I want to, George, Emma, or Doug, anything you want to kind of just thoughts or anything on any of this you want to offer?
Yeah, I think those last 4 points, so the elected officials that believe in accountability. So I didn't know going into this, but the impact that district attorneys have, they have so much power, right? And I don't think many people understand how much power they have. And so being able to elect district attorneys who are progressive in the mindset of being able to help hold not only, community accountable, but also law enforcement accountable is an important next step in kind of changing the narrative and changing the dynamic of how community and police engage with each other. So, number one, just knowing the importance of the district attorney and, actually voting for them when it's time to vote for them. And then, as Chelsea mentioned, just the impact that mass incarceration has on the community. So, going back to the thought about being empathetic, when you think about, let's just think about a normal home, right? You have a normal home. Right. You have two parents in the household, right? And you have children who are growing up with those two parents, and one parent is removed from that household because they're now placed into into the criminal justice system. Whatever that case may be, like there's an impact, there's a trauma that's happening to that family. And that trauma doesn't just stop with that one generation or that second generation. That trauma impacts the third, fourth, and even fifth generation. And we know this to be the case, right? We know the studies, we know the research, we know the data. And so, talking about the impacts of mass incarceration, it really comes down to being empathetic and understanding that we have to get this right. It's so important for us to get this right, because if we get it wrong, we're causing trauma to families that, will take a long time for them to recover from this. Not only getting it right in terms of making sure that we are prosecuting and incarcerating people who actually need to be incarcerated, but also making sure that we have the resources available for the families that are dealing with this trauma afterwards. And whether that's, while these people are still incarcerated or when they get out of incarceration. And so I'm really, I take a human approach to this in all of it, honestly. But to me, it's like, in order for us to solve the problem, like I'm not saying that there are people that need to be incarcerated, right? Let's just be honest about it. There are people who do sex trafficking. There are people who kill other people. So there are things that need to be done with these kinds of people, these types of people. But there are also people who are just going to jail because they're stealing food, right? Or they got a DUI and they made a bad mistake and they need to be rehabilitated and re-engage into the community. And so there needs to be resources and services geared towards them so that we can get it right, so that trauma doesn't linger and affect future generations and cause the same problem systemically.
And recognizing too, just something that had come out last week that's just interesting, whatever your position on marijuana, there are people still in prisons and jails for marijuana usage, but there are also states that are pushing programs giving marijuana for COVID vaccines, people that come and get those. And so when you see that sort of discrepancy, can we at least get the system right, that if we're going to legalize this, then get those people out, because what are they there for?
Yeah. And just when you talk about the district attorneys too, one of the other issues on the last podcast you got into is, the court appointments, and that both at the federal level and then there's stuff at the state level. But so one of the systemic issues that obviously in the justice system we face is, who gets charged, what do they get charged with? So is it going to be a mandatory sentence, or is it not going to be a mandatory sentence? Is it going to be life without parole, or whatever those, there's a lot of charging decisions that go along the way. And then obviously then the judge has a lot of discretion depending on what the conviction is for. And then what are people actually getting sentenced to based on some kind of mutuality or equality with others similarly situated. And the statistics are not very supportive of the system as it relates to being fair between equally situated parties, based on color.
Right.
So that's a huge issue as well. And so those are kind of things. And so holding district attorneys accountable for who they charge, what they charge them with, and then what they do with those things, and then how the sentencing judges do it as well. So there's lots too. We talked about this last week with school discipline and getting into the juvenile justice system and young girls of color and young boys of color and what happens to them and all that kind of stuff, which cycles it. And then Doug, you're talking about the trauma that's inflicted when you take one parent out, and then it sets the whole cycle kind of back into play. And then we're just repeating it. So anyway, well, let's look at some reforms then. So I've been chatting a lot. I want to, George, Emma, anything? They're just nodding at me. Okay, shut up and go on. Anyway, Doctor, I think everybody's heard me. So Doug, why don't you open us with, do you have that form in front of you or not? I don't know.
Yeah. Do.
Why don't you open us up with criminal justice reform and the guiding objectives, and we can chat about those.
Yeah, so our guiding objectives for criminal justice reform are change local and state government policies and laws through advocacy that impact criminal justice reform legislation. And then number 2, educate the public on social justice and racial equality issues directly impacting local communities while engaging public participation towards those solutions. So I'll pause there. Chelsea, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I think really in the criminal justice space, if we were to boil it down, it's about legislation and education. And so first getting that legislation right to make sure that, again, going back to changing systems, we're supporting individuals that are working towards change, individuals that have maybe slipped through some sort of fallacy in the system, and then the upcoming generation. But then the education around the narrative change within the general public, and making sure that we aren't using words like felon or narrative specific language. Sorry, narrative specific meaning language that we change, but then narrative specific meaning the stories that we tell. So how this is being communicated on the news and inciting fear. So then some of these reforms, they seem totally out of line with, well, we need to be safe and we need to protect this type of person. A lot of that work is working to shift the narrative, open people's eyes through education and statistics information so that they understand what the real root cause of some of these problems are. and how we can address it without having to hinder someone else's life cycle.
Okay. All right. Doug, anything on that one, or you're gonna rest on Dr. Hayward's?
No, I'm gonna rest on Dr. Hayward. You want me to go into the area of focus?
Yeah. Or which, so I'm just conscious too that we've been going for a little bit. So I want you guys to highlight this stuff because I want to make sure we get to all the important stuff. So whatever you guys want to cover, I know we wanted to touch on the Player Coalition wins in this category, but yeah, why don't we hit the areas of focus and some of the stats in there, Doug? Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah. So the area of focus, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, mass incarceration, specifically of people of color, juvenile justice reform, prosecutor accountability. Top line stats, 2,700 people currently sentenced to die for crimes committed as children. That goes back to the empathy part. Let's make sure we're getting that right. 470,000 people are held in custody on a nightly basis without conviction. And this is, we dove into this in Washington, more specifically Seattle, but obviously we're talking about this throughout the country. But the cash bail system, it's an antiquated system. There's a lot of issues with it. And going back to Chelsea's earlier point, really trying to educate not only ourselves, but also the public about the narrative of cash bail. So there's this narrative that cash bail is necessary, but we've seen in a number of cases when cash bail is eliminated that people still show up to their court appointments, right? And they're not being held in these situations now they lose their job, now, their car gets towed or all of these other things that they have to respond to afterwards. It's not an impact on their, being able to fix to get a resolution to the situation. And so that's something that is really important to me that I've been diving into a lot lately too. Pretrial detention,
Doug, let me
holding of non-convicted. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I got 25 years as a criminal defense lawyer. You know what I mean? So some of the most important parts of our case, right, would be for working class folks. I'd be at the jail because that's where they get arrested and they're sitting in jail. I have to go to the jail. Yeah. And there's a whole security thing there and it's a real pain in the butt to get in there. So it's hard on lawyers to do some of that in these jurisdictions. And then everything's by video conference now. And so then often it's the first time I've gotten a call in the middle of the night. I'm showing up. And then, and it's not like it's a ton of money. So a lot of times it's 5,000 or so, and not that's, I don't mean to minimize that, but like in some people's mind, $5,000. Well, a lot of folks don't have $5,000 in cash. Right. And so then here's somebody punching a clock. They got bills. They're living month to month. They may have 2 or 3 kids at home. They got an apartment, car payment, like you said. And now they can't come up with the 5,000. And so a lot of this is set by statute based on whether it's a misdemeanor, aggravated, or whatever. And then, there the person sits for 2.5, 3 months waiting for their trial to come up. And then what happens, it pushes them into an early plea bargain because they just want to get on the street. And so they'll plea it down to something, but it's a misdemeanor. And then that's the first tick on the box. And then if they get it picked up again, now the next one is much more severe. So it all feeds into this difficulty about just surviving the system. And the cash bail stuff is really, really difficult for people. So I think that is one of the huge issues the Players Coalition can address and work on. And I think as a country, it's really important. Yeah,
I appreciate you saying that. As somebody who has experience in the system in that way, the impacts of it. So
saw it over and over and over all the time. So, okay, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but anyway, okay. Number 3 there, top line stats.
Yeah, pretrial detention. So holding non-convicted defendants in jail pending trial. Another aspect of this is actually demonstrating, again, to Chelsea's point, educating the public about the narrative. Like, it's really easy to put it in numbers, dollars and cents. So what the cost is, right? So pretrial detention costs $13.6 billion a year, right? So being able to eliminate that saves us a lot of money and be able to redirect that money towards services and programs that, alleviate a lot of the problems that we see here.
Okay.
Chelsea, you wanted to add anything to that?
No, I think just as we're going through this, one of the important things to remember is that like a lot of this stuff, maybe people haven't heard before and it can seem really in the weeds, but it's what's shaping our society. And so it's important to pay attention to because $13.6 billion can go towards supporting students, can go towards supporting ending hunger, can support ending homelessness. Like we have real pressing problems. And then we have the opposite where we're spending money in spaces that we don't have to. And so a lot of these issues we can get into the weeds of like why this is wrong and what the stat is behind that. But just generally understanding that when people say the system is broken, it means that we're keeping people down that don't need to be kept down and not uplifting people that need uplifting, from my perspective.
Yeah. And the narrative especially when I'm talking to more conservative groups, right, that don't necessarily see the same way that I see, right? It's a good point to bring up to them. And, in regards to conservatism, they always talk about how they want smaller government. They think the government's inefficient, right? So yeah, if you believe that, then you would also believe that government and how they handle criminal justice would also be slow and inefficient, right? And so it's no different. There's an inefficiency here that just doesn't make sense. It's not empathetic, and could also save us a lot of money if we approached it differently.
Indeed. So, why don't you guys look then? What are some of the PC wins you want to talk about, and/or some of the reform efforts that you're undertaking?
Chelsea, you want to take these?
I think a couple of the important ones that we wanted to highlight was the Louisiana decision, or the Louisiana legislation that passed to require unanimous decisions in felonies. And so prior to, some of our New Orleans guys had worked on that one, but prior to its passing, you could be sentenced to whatever amount of time you were sentenced for at like a 7-5 vote. So if everyone didn't unanimously agree on you being convicted, you could still go to jail. And so it was sort of the luck of the draw, like, okay, well, I hope that if my case is close, I end up with the right amount, versus having a unanimous decision in which everyone unilaterally decides that this person is or is not guilty. And that's important when you're talking about the impact of someone's life. So to Doug's point earlier about having a humanistic perspective, just taking that person and putting yourself in their shoes, what would you want? I think I would want someone to be absolutely certain that I did or didn't do what I was being charged for, if it meant uprooting my entire life and then generations to come, based off what Doug was also mentioning earlier. And so that case is really important. Another one back in NOLA was supporting public defenders. And so the prosecution is normally very heavily funded versus public defenders, which is a free service to individuals going through trial. It's a subsidied service, but getting that funding that they need to make sure that they're not taking on the caseload that, as these people are still humans, are tired out, and maybe they missed something, or maybe they don't have the time to go into detail that they would if they had a smaller caseload, because there were more funds distributed to get people the justice they deserve. And I think from a criminal justice reform perspective, those are two of the ones that are really important to highlight. But we've done a lot of work also in California, in Pennsylvania, just related to some of that pre and post incarceration time. So we can go into youth justice, I think, unless you had anything to add there. Well,
I just want to say that it's a really rare that the states, so when I read that one, when you guys gave me this info, like at the federal level, right, felony mandatory, you got to have a unanimous decision. So which means if there's 12 people on the jury, you go through whatever 2 or 3 day trial, all 12 have to say yes. If just one says no, you're not guilty and you walk, which, that's in the whole point. If you're going to take somebody's freedom away and put him in prison or jail, then that's the kind of justice that you need to be able to convince all 12 people. If you can't, then the state should lose. So when I was reading that and I kind of looked at that, I thought so that's one of those systemic issues, and I think that's a huge one. So I'm so glad that you guys brought that to our attention. So no, that was all I had. I think those are really good. And public defenders, I've worked side by side with them for years and realized that. And and so the states I've been at, typically they're working around 200 caseload at a minimum per person, which is super difficult to do. You know what I mean? So like I'd get to 20, 30, maybe 40 on a regular basis, and to really represent people and do it right, it gets really difficult. So that point is well taken, that they need the funding, so you have the bodies, and you don't have to take so many cases and have the resources. So, all right, then youth justice reform. You guys can lead us through that a little bit on some of those points. Anything?
Two of just the main lenses that we've operated in that space is raising the age from which youth can be tried or prosecuted as adults. And so in some states, it could be as young as 12. And by law, you're technically not an adult until you're 18. And so recognizing that the human brain isn't finished developing until it's 25, but you're charging this minor with a crime where they're still figuring things out. You go back to that trauma, whatever they're experiencing at home, at school, and how that maybe is impacting whatever behavior or choices that they've made. You want to make sure that you're, again, supporting the people that need support. And so raising that age to give the youth a chance without discarding them becomes really important in fostering a functioning society moving forward. and then ending juvenile life without parole in that same regard of making sure that if a minor is convicted of a crime, that you can't convict them to stay in prison for the rest of their life. So say you were 16 years old, you committed a crime, even if it was grossly negligent, to make sure that that child has a chance at parole or reform, because what happens is the recidivism in those cases, the recidivism rate, meaning the chances that they'll commit a crime and go back to jail, is extremely low. In addition to, again, that change piece of understanding what it means to act not out of emotion and with their behavior and the remorse that they show. And so there's just so much research behind why it's important not to tell an 18-year-old that they have to spend the rest of their life in a 6x9 cell.
Yeah. I spent a lot of time arguing waiver hearings, so they could go usually down to 15 years old. And if the crime wasn't a felony, we'd always be in a waiver hearing trying to push somebody into adult court. So it's really difficult. And a lot of times they're successful with it. If you're 17, it's a no-brainer. They're gone. The difficulty then after that, if you have any kind of real prison sentence, even if you're convicted and going to prison, is that then you're putting 16-year-olds into an adult maximum security prison, and that just generates a whole nother set of issues. So, okay. Well, then let's, boy, we've been just going here on the justice. So good job, guys. George, Emma, any?
You're doing it.
We're just rambling. So, okay. We had a couple, and I think we've touched on some of this kind of stuff. So, is there anything that we haven't talked about around these issues that you think is really important for people to understand, either just kind of as it addresses kind of systemic issues, social injustice, or racial inequality? So we've been kind of looking at some of these pieces, but is there anything that you think is important that you want to make sure that we address?
I mean, just for me personally, it's like, as I continue to educate myself and go through the process of trying to figure out where I fit in and how I can help change some of these things, it really just comes down to spending time trying to be empathetic, right? Kind of similar to what Chelsea said, putting yourself in the other person's shoes and really trying to figure out what would I want, right, in this situation. And also knowing that, like, whether it's a police officer or a community member, like, the differences are not that vast. Like, we're not that different, you know? Like, we all want to go home to our families at the end of the day. You know, like, we're all human. And the emotions and the feelings and the desires that we all have as humans is very similar. And so being able to bridge that gap and understanding each other from a human level, obviously is going to take time and empathy. But if we can get there, I think it solves a lot of these problems, or at least pushes us in a direction where we can have, you know, some united front on changing some of these issues and solving some of these problems. So I guess, not that we didn't talk about it, but I always emphasize it, taking that time to be empathetic about somebody else who, you know, you'd never experienced their life trauma or their problems, but being empathetic and understanding what they've gone through and why they've gone through it. I don't know, it brings a little bit more opening and understanding to the problem at hand.
Yeah, being human, to Doug's point, is not always the easiest thing. Being human can be really hard, and these systems just make it harder. And so our work is around changing that and then getting other people to expand their worldview and understanding what that looks like for someone in an experience they maybe never had partaken in.
Yeah. So just a bit of empathy on both sides. And again, I hope that the conversation that we've had today, we're not in any way trying to demonize anybody or, you know, do all that. There's a lot of difficult, complicated issues on there, but there is some movement in a certain direction that certainly we feel like we got to be working on. Well, let's do this. And, you know, there's the broader stuff. I had some other pieces in there, but I think we've really covered a lot of ground. I guess what I do want to tie and give us an opportunity. And so everybody gets to talk about this one. All right. So, and it doesn't, if it's related to this topic, that's great. But I guess I always want to kind of look at where's your hope in all this? Because this is kind of, you know, I don't want to say Debbie Downer, but we're talking about some really hard issues. I mean, and the impact on our communities and our culture and our society has been very profound, and particularly with people of color in these areas. And so it's kind of tough that way. But so Doug, you know, given all this and all the stuff that you're working on and things that you've seen and where you've come from and all that, so where's the hope for you now? You know, what gives you hope in the midst of all this?
I mean, you look at the younger population, the younger generation, and how active they've been, right? Like, that's something that is very encouraging and very hopeful. You know, I recognize that it's also trauma that they're going through, right? So those kids who went through, you know, the Parkland shooting, like, those kids they're going to be experiencing that trauma for the rest of their lives, and their children are probably going to be impacted. That trauma is going to spill onto their children to some degree, right? And I think it's important that they're active and engaged with our system so that, you know, even on that front, that we can make significant change and progress. But even just the families and the young people who are impacted by, you know, police interaction, you know, not getting so discouraged and so lost in despair to think that nothing can change, that nothing can happen, right? Like I see more and more people realizing that their voice matters and that their impact can matter, and that we're not hopeless, and that there is positivity and change that can happen. And so that's what makes me hopeful. That's what makes me encouraged, seeing more and more people come to the table and saying, no, this is not right. How do we fix it? And I want to be a part of it. And, you know, we see it throughout the NFL. We see it in the NBA. We see all the sports leagues. And, you know, we know that those people in the sports league have influence and leadership capabilities, and they're, you know, influencing regular everyday citizens to do the same work. So that's really hopeful for me.
All right. Emma, George, anybody talk about hope?
Oh yeah. I mean, just listening, I know I didn't, you know, contribute a ton. This is like Doug, you said earlier, like about mindfulness. You know, I don't have the most education or, you know, the language to talk about these things, but one of my favorite things is just like being able to sit in these podcasts and like listen to you talk and listen to Dr. Heyward and listen to McCourty talk. Things that I've learned just, you know, sitting here, and now I can go have a conversation with one of my teammates in my locker room, and maybe I don't have to change their opinion, but I can have I can have that communication with them. I can have that conversation with them, and it can, you know, then they can go have a conversation with someone else. And just the fact that we're having this discussion, then, I mean, like you said, you get one person in a room with you, and you can like either, you know, connect with them on a level of empathy, or you can, you know, have a conversation with them that can, you know, kind of change their mind or change their opinion on something. And it just means a lot to me that you guys take the time to come have a conversation with us, and especially my, you know, my family. So I just appreciate that. So thank you.
Of course. Appreciate you giving us the opportunity and the platform to do so.
Lubu?
So this is actually something that Dr. Heyward said last week, but I've been thinking a ton about it lately. But what you said was the speed at which change can happen when professional athletes get involved, just because of like the clout, but also their power and their influence. And I find it so inspiring to now be learning more, like even just this whole last week when I was cutting up the clips and reading more about the Players Coalition and learning about you guys, seeing how many different athletes are involved and like all the different things that you guys are already doing. It's so exciting to me to kind of be meeting this next wave, or new to us in a way. So not new to you guys, but new to us, of like people who are doing the things that we're so passionate about, and to be connected with you guys is very inspiring.
All right, I'll go next. We'll give Dr. Heyward the last word because she's so smart. She's so smart and statistical. Well, Doug, I was kind of with you on that. I just feel like the level of conversation has really increased. You know, I mean, and unfortunately with his murder, you know, with George, that, and then the trial and everything. But I mean, I thought that videotape, I think, resonated with people. It reminded me a little bit about, you know, the freedom marches in the 60s, you know, where they were taking the hose and blasting people. And it was the first time that national TV covered that stuff, you know, and then when it hit the nation, there were people that like go, holy, what is going on here? You know what I mean? And a lot of that stuff had gone on forever. And, you know, and so that gives me a little bit of hope that there is this increased conversation. And then I think the other thing that I've really been just wrestling with, and I want to be hopeful about it, is the depth of the divisiveness in our country right now. Seems like it is such a level, and I'm hoping that it's kind of leveling off, you know, given kind of where we're at with our leadership and that kind of stuff. But, you know, my hope is that we can kind of reach across and have, you know, the conversations that you're talking about in an empathetic way, that we may disagree on where we're going, but at least if we can agree that the final point is that everybody can go home at night and be safe and be with their loved ones, and can provide, you know, meals and all the stuff that we want to do for our families, and do that in a ways that is respectful and, you know, compassionate. Then if we could at least have that conversation, if we get back to what felt like in the 90s, we just kind of disagree on how to get there, but we're all trying to get to the same spot. But that's not how it's felt the last, you know, it's been different than that. So I hope that we're on a, you know, kind of riding the tide that's bringing us back together in some kind of way, and we can continue this conversation at a real heartfelt level that addresses people's concerns, and we can continue to move forward. All right. Dr. Heyward, hit us with stats and all the university things, whatever. Come on.
I think just in general, my hope is in people like Doug, who have the platform, who take the time to educate themselves and then continue to advocate. People like you guys who are doing the same thing and then sharing the stories of people like Doug, people like the grassroots organizations working day in and day out, people like the younger generation who are doing what they can while they can, whether or not they know what direction something's going. They're just so fired up. That's really encouraging. And if we look at it, to your point earlier around the tide, if we look at it sort of like a dam and we're all just taking a rock away from this blockage, and eventually we'll get to a point where we're a free-flowing society that everyone cares for another. And maybe that's too aspirational. But knowing that it's potentially possible, I think gives me hope in society and where we can go from here.
Well, let's keep that vision, because we're dreamers, and we believe in dreaming, and we believe in big visions and manifesting that reality, and so the world rises up to meet us with the expectations that we project. And so we are projecting this free-flowing river of diversity and inclusion, and get back to empathy and love in the Doug Baldwin kind of way. So we will kind of continue to do that. So Doug, thanks so much for being vulnerable with us today and sharing your story. Really appreciate it. It's great to get to know you a little bit, outside the helmet and all that kind of thing. And so that's great. Congratulations on the family and the daughters.
Thank
and all
you.
that kind of stuff. It's great. So I will just say, enjoy it, because it goes super fast, because here they are just, like outgrown me, and pretty soon put me in a chair and all that kind of stuff. And Dr. Hayward, thank you again. We got one more to do. We're super excited about that. We'll finalize a date for that next week. It's been great getting to know the work of the Players Coalition, and hope this keeps moving us along. So any other final comments from anybody?
I'm good.
All right, so that looks like a wrap. So episode 2 is in the books with the Players Coalition. Again, our thanks. You guys have a great weekend. And Dr. Hayward, you and I will be talking next week to get the next one lined up. So thank you so much.
Sounds good. Thank you
Thank
guys
you.
both.
All right, take care. Thank you, guys.
All right, guys. Thank you.